Welcome to this video on common nutritional terminology. We're going to define some key terms, terms that you'll have heard plenty of times, terms that you'll need to know and understand. Let's take a look at some of these. So the food that you eat can be divided into different types or can be classified under different headings. So when we eat, we are essentially consuming different kinds of foods, and we can split the food into two primary categories, and that would be macronutrients and micronutrients. Macronutrients are essentially those nutrients, those parts of our food, those parts of the things that we eat that we need in large quantities, hence the term macro, meaning large. Macronutrients, nutrients that we need a lot of. And then we've also got micronutrients, and again the term gives you a clue here. Micro, we don't need too much of this. So these are the nutrients which are essential for us, but we need them in far smaller quantities or far smaller amounts. So I'm going to talk to you today in this session about 3 different macronutrients and 2 different micronutrients. So 3 macronutrients and 2 micronutrients, and we're just going to introduce them so you understand how they relate to one another and what headings they come under and so on. But we're not going to get into massive amount of detail on each of these. So what are the macronutrients? The 3 key macronutrients are carbohydrates, lipids, sometimes just referred to as fats, and proteins. So carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. They're the 3 macronutrients. The 2 types of micronutrients, however, are vitamins and minerals. Vitamins and minerals. Now, as we've said already, macronutrients, these are the things, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins that we need to eat in large quantities. And then we also need to consume much smaller quantities of vitamins and minerals. So what do we mean when we say carbohydrates? What's included under that heading? Well, I'm going to divide them into 3 headings in terms of carbohydrates, 3 types or 3 classifications of carbohydrates, and they will be sugars, starches, and fiber. Sugars, starches, and fiber. And just very briefly on these, sugars tend to be small chain carbohydrates. So when we consume them, we can absorb them very quickly. Starches are longer chain carbohydrates, and fibers tend to be very long chain carbohydrates that our intestines struggle to break down. We can't really absorb fiber, and that's why it's helpful to maintain gut health and keep things moving nicely through the bowels. So you've got sugar, starches, and fiber as different types of carbohydrates. Then in terms of lipids, or sometimes referred to as fats generally, I'm going to suggest to you that there's 2 types of lipids, and there's other ways we could categorize these, but I'm going to categorize them as fats and oils. And in this sense, I'm going to say that fats are any lipids that are solid at room temperature, for example butter, and oils are any of those lipids that are liquid at room temperature, for example sunflower oil. Now there's other ways we can categorize or classify these. We can classify according to how saturated the fats are, and they are linked. That the idea of a saturated and unsaturated fat is actually linked into the structure of the fats and whether or not they're solid or liquid at room temperature, but we'll get into that in another video. So in terms of carbohydrates, we've got sugars, starches, and fiber. In terms of lipids, we've got fats and oils. And then really, I'm not going to break down proteins into separate types of proteins, except to just mention that all proteins are made of a range or a number of what we call amino acids. And again, we'll come back to that in a later video. So what about micronutrients? We've said that we need vitamins and we need minerals in our diet, and these are the ones that we need in much smaller quantities, and yet they're still essential. What vitamins do we need? Well, again, to classify them, there are a whole load of different vitamins and minerals, which I'm not going to talk about specifically in detail, but there are a couple of categories. So in terms of vitamins, 2 categories of vitamins. There will be water-soluble vitamins. So those are most of the B vitamins and vitamin C. And then there's also fat-soluble vitamins. So fat-soluble vitamins would be vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. So we need all of those in our diet, and some of those can be classified as water soluble. That is, they'll dissolve in water, and that's how they're transported around the body. And there are those 4 other vitamins that I've just mentioned, A, D, E, and K, that are fat soluble. That is, they dissolve essentially in fat. The fat soluble vitamins we can store because they're fat soluble, but the water soluble vitamins we can't store, so we need to eat them regularly. So we come finally to the second kind of micronutrient, and that is minerals. And there's 2 types of minerals that we need to mention, and that is macro minerals and trace minerals. Now, macro, we've already mentioned what the word or the prefix macro means. It means large. So of the minerals that we consume, the ones that we need the most of, that we'd probably measure in hundreds of milligrams per day, or require in hundreds of milligrams per day, are the larger minerals. And then the trace minerals we need very, very little of. So macro minerals will be things like calcium. I'm not going to get into great detail on that here, but things like calcium, which is essential for bone health, also used in muscle contraction as well. As I'm sure you know, we need that in comparatively large quantities compared to some of the other minerals. So macro minerals will be things like calcium. And then trace minerals, minerals like iron, selenium, copper, those sorts of minerals, required in a lot smaller quantities, but nevertheless are really important for a range of purposes, most of which have kind of very specialized purposes. So for example, iron is very important as a component of hemoglobin, helps us transport oxygen around the body in the bloodstream. What do we mean by the term dietary reference values? Dietary reference values, another key nutritional term. We used to refer to dietary reference values as recommended daily allowance, and the idea of RDA, or recommended daily allowance, is kind of into common parlance. Lots of people use that term, but in the industry and in nutritional circles, the term recommended daily allowance isn't really used anymore. We favour now the idea of dietary reference values. And there are several different types of dietary reference values, and I'm only going to mention 2 here. The first of which is known as the EAR, which is the estimated average requirements. The estimated average requirements. So that's for any particular nutrient that we might be talking about, whether it's carbohydrates or whatever. It might even be a micronutrient. But for a group of people, let's say males, or let's say children, or whatever, or maybe even the entire population, for whatever group we're talking about, the EAR is the average requirement. So specifically the mean requirement of energy or of a nutrient needed by that group of people. So the estimated average requirement. So if you could have, in a population of people, if you had 100 people, you'd have 50 people needing slightly more, you'd have 50 people needing slightly less, or thereabouts. So your EAR is whatever is right in the middle of their requirements for that group. Okay, so that might be in terms of the total energy they require, or it might be in terms of the total amount of iron that they require, or whatever. So it will be varying slightly depending on the group, but we take the EAR as being the mean of that group. We count them all together. So that's one dietary reference value. A second important dietary reference value is the RNI. The RNI, that's the reference nutrient intake. The reference nutrient intake. And this simply means the amount of a nutrient that's enough to ensure that the needs of nearly all of a group, that's 97.5%, are being met. So the EAR splits sort of down the middle. It's the average, it's the mean, it's right in the middle of the group. But the RNI would be sufficient for almost the entire group. So if you go right up to the top end of requirements, the required nutrient intake at the top end of that group, whoever it is that's right at the top end, the 97.5 percentile, right up at the top end, even they will have enough based on the RNI. If they were to have the reference nutrient intake for that particular nutrient, then 97.5% of that population or of that group would have enough of that nutrient. So that's the RNI, and it works out roughly, for those of you who are mathematically minded, it works out roughly to include 2 standard deviations from the mean, from the estimated average requirements. Okay, so what about energy measures then? What about energy measures? There are different ways that we can measure the amount of energy that we're talking about. And so in particular, when we talk about energy, we're talking about the energy produced by metabolism and the energy that is produced through the metabolism of carbohydrates and fats. Now, it is possible the body is able to use protein to produce energy, to break down for energy, but it will do that as a last resort. It will certainly begin with carbohydrates and fats. And so how do we measure how much energy is available to us, how much it is being broken down? So we measure it in one of two ways. We either use the calorie as a measurement of energy, and a calorie is defined as the energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. The energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. That's what a calorie is. So we sometimes use calories and we sometimes use joules. So the joules is the imperial measurement, and the joule is the energy required to move a mass of 1 gram at a velocity of 1 meter per second. Now you might immediately be thinking, well, this is a little bit irrelevant to me. This doesn't make too much sense. It's not very helpful or very useful. A calorie and a joule are such small amounts of energy that when we're talking about the amount of food that we eat, they become so minuscule compared to the amount of food we eat that they become almost pointless talking in terms of calories and joules. So what we actually do is we use a much more useful measure, and we use the kilocalorie or the kilojoule. So the kilocalorie, which is abbreviated kcal, or the kilojoule, which is abbreviated kj. Now this is where it gets slightly confusing, because whereas a calorie is defined here on the screen, 1,000 of those calories is a kilocalorie. But confusingly, we now, having used kilocalories for a while, we now generally refer to them as calories. So when you hear somebody talking about how many calories is this food and how many calories is that food and how many calories have I expended in this exercise, they're almost certainly talking about kilocalories. That's a little bit confusing. We've got so used to talking about kilocalories with the term calorie that we've kind of forgotten that we've made that change. So a calorie has kind of become technically 1,000 calories is a kilocalorie, but now we started calling kilocalories by the name calories. So I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing, isn't it? But you'll still see on packaging kcal or kj. So for example, here is what you might find on a package of food. So in the UK, we have this traffic light system. I know in various other countries as well, we have a traffic light system that helps you understand what's in the food that you're eating. And you'll notice that on the left-hand side, in the energy box, in the white box on the left, it tells us for whatever food this is. I'm not entirely sure what food this is, but on the packet, it tells us that in this packet there is 13% of an adult's reference intake. So we've just mentioned what reference intake is all about. So 13% of an adult's reference intake of energy is in this food, whatever this food might be. And that can be measured, as we've said, in joules or calories. And as you can see here, specifically kilojoules and kilocalories. So it's 250 kilocalories. We'd probably, as I've already mentioned, we'd just refer to that as calories, 250 calories. But you need to remember in the back of your mind that we're actually specifically talking about kilocalories. It's a little confusing, isn't it? But in terms of energy, in terms of kilojoules, we stick with kilojoules. So 1,046 kilojoules, or works out roughly the same as 250 calories or kilocalories. So if you wanted to make a conversion between the two, if you wanted to take kilocalories and work out how much that would be in terms of kilojoules, a simple rule would be that 1 kilocalorie is approximately 4 kilojoules. So you can see here in the example, 250 kilocalories times by 4, that would give us 1,000. That's there or thereabouts in terms of kilojoules. So if you're trying to convert between the two, it's a multiplication by 4 to go from calories to joules. Now in terms of energy balance then, we have this concept of energy balance which is all about how we balance the energy that's going out, the energy that we're using up, and the energy that's coming in. And so if the energy that's coming in, so that's the energy that we're deriving, as we've just mentioned, we're deriving from our food as we eat, as we take food in, macronutrients, micronutrients, so as it all comes in, as we eat it and we digest it and so on, the amount of energy that comes in, if that equals, it's the same amount of energy as the energy that is being expended, the energy that's going out. So that's energy that we use to stay alive, which we call our basal metabolism, but also the energy we use for movement, the energy that we use for exercise, the energy that we use to digest our food. If all of the energy coming in equals the energy going out, then you have those two things balanced. We say that that person is in an energy balance. And so they're not going to gain or lose weight because they're in energy balance. They're taking just the right amount for the amount of expenditure. Now, obviously, we can manipulate this by either changing the amount of food that we eat, the amount of energy that comes in, or the amount of exercise that we do, which is the energy going out. So, for example, if the energy that goes out, so the exercise that we do, if we decide to do a whole load of running or a whole load of weights or whatever, and the energy that we're using up, the energy that's going out, the energy that we're expending, if that exceeds the energy that's coming in, well, as you can imagine, we will start to lose weight because we're using more energy than we are replacing. So if the energy out exceeds the energy in, then a person will lose weight. And the converse is also true. If the energy that we're taking in, so we're eating lots and lots of food and we're not using that energy, so the energy out is much lower than the energy in, then that person will gain weight. That's the concept of energy balance. It's the relationship between the energy coming in and the energy going out, mainly through exercise. So what things affect energy balance then? So let's finish up with this. So there are several things, and there's lots we could talk about, but let's just hone in on 5 things that will affect the energy balance. And it might affect it on the intake side or on the output side, the energy expenditure or the energy intake side, either or both of those sides. The first thing would be basal metabolism. So as I've already just mentioned, basal metabolism is the amount of energy expended just to keep you alive. So whilst you're awake, not consuming food, not digesting food, but awake, that's the amount of energy that you're using at that point is your basal metabolism. And it differs depending on your size, depending on your muscle mass, depending on various different factors. It also depends on your age. So basal metabolism, the amount of energy that your body needs to burn to stay alive, actually drops as you get older. So once you pass puberty and into adulthood, as you go past various milestones, age milestones, your basal metabolism begins to drop off. So you require less intake in order to achieve an energy balance, which is why you'll often find that elderly people tend to eat significantly less than people in their sort of 30s and 40s, because they don't require that energy intake to match the energy expenditure. Sex is also part of what affects energy balance. So male or female, generally speaking across the population, males require a greater number of calories in order to maintain their energy balance compared to females. And again, that's individual dependent, but across the population, males tend to require a greater volume of energy than females do in order to maintain an energy balance. The climate in which you live also has an impact. Very, very cold climates, for example, people who live in very cold climates tend to have a much higher requirement for energy in, because their bodies are working so much harder in order to keep their core temperatures at a healthy thermostatic level, or homeostasis, I should say. thermoregulated. And then finally, physical activity obviously is going to have a big impact in terms of the energy expenditure. So energy expenditure, energy output is affected by physical activity. What sorts of things do we mean? So, well, first of all, energy expenditure of physical activity differs depending on the intensity and the duration of the exercise that you do. So the more that you do, the more intense it is, or the longer it's for, the greater the amount of energy expenditure. And so if the greater the amount of energy expenditure, if you're looking to stay in energy balance and you've got a high energy expenditure, you need to increase your intake so that you can balance those two things out, whether you can measure it in calories or joules or however you want to, but you've got to balance it out if you don't want to either gain or lose weight. You might want to do one of those two things, in which case you can manipulate things. We'll talk about that in another video. So in terms of different energy expenditures for different kinds of exercise, these following data are based on a person weighing 70 kilograms. It's about 155 pounds. For those of you in the US who are still using pounds. Let me just give you a few examples of different activities and how they convert into calorie expenditure. So I've just put 4 here, a bit of variety. So this is calorie expenditure for half an hour of the stated activity. So half an hour's water aerobics for a person of roughly 70 kilograms, half an hour's water aerobics, they would expend about 149 calories per half an hour. Wheelchair basketball would see you expend, if you're 70 kgs, obviously it will change depending on if you're heavier or not, but wheelchair basketball, 70 kgs, you'll be looking at expending around 242 calories per half an hour. Football or soccer, if you prefer, about 260 calories per half an hour. And then running, so right up at the very, very intense end, if you're doing 6-minute mile pace, which is a very quick pace, if you were to do that for half an hour, you would expend 614 calories. And again, remember, kilocalories is specifically what we're talking about here. So we've talked about all sorts of different things here. We've talked about energy balance. We've talked about the factors that affect energy balance. We've talked about the different ways that we measure energy, calories and joules, kilocalories, kilojoules, dietary reference values as well. And we spent the first part of the lesson, or the first part of this video, thinking about macro and micronutrients. Well, don't forget to like the video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification icon so you get updated every time I upload something new. If you've got any questions, I know that nutrition is an area that a lot of people have got a lot of questions about, and I intend to make several more similar teaching videos along these lines and get into each of these things in a bit more detail. But don't forget to put any questions in the comments below and I will get back to you. But other than that, enjoy the rest of your day, take care for now, see you in the next video.